Hello, I'm Seth Kim Cohen. I'm an artist and a writer, and I've put together a playlist of videos that revolve around the character of Carlos the Jackal, the Venezuelan terrorist. Hi, I'm Seth Kim Cohen. I'm an artist and a writer, so what we're talking about, I've put together a YouTube playlist that revolves more or less around the figure of Carlos the Jackal, the Argentinian terrorist who was active in the 1970s and 80s. And this was inspired by this film. It was sort of inspired by this film that was directed by the French director Olivier Assayas. What we're talking about is the international terrorist known as Carlos the Jackal, who was active in the 70s and 80s as a kind of leftist, Marxist, pro-Palestinian terrorist. And it was inspired by this film by Olivier Assayas called Carlos, a 6-hour film. And also inspired by a quote in the booklet that comes with the DVD from the writer Grill Marcus, who's written Lipstick Traces, The Old Weird America, and The Dustbin of History, and In the Fascist Bathroom. And I've titled the playlist Want, because really what these historical events are about, and what this film by Olivier Assayas is really about what people want, really about how want is not a kind of natural impulse, and that in fact before we want anything we first have to want something, and how that want to want is generated is really, I think, the chief question, the chief problematic of politics. And Grill Marcus, talking about the music in the film, says, we hear, almost see, Numbers by the Feelies and New Order, the Dead Boys Sonic Reducer, and most viscerally Wires Dot Dash, a song that seems to terrorize itself. Not in any way keyed to the scenes with chronological soundtrack of our lives' banality, the songs raise the question of whether the best and most adventurous music of the late 1970s and early 1980s was itself as animated by international terrorism, by the specter of a world where at times it could seem that only a few armed Gnostics were in control, as by anything else. Suggesting that the reason that this music works in this film is because post-punk music is, as he says, animated by the specter of international terrorism in the 70s and 80s. Does he actually say specter? Yeah, the specter. just now realizing that he used that word. And the notion that music is somehow invented by, or informed at least by the activities of terrorists in the 70s and 80s seems really a flippant connection to make, and I'm really wary of equations that are so causal in that sense. I mean, if anything, if any argument's to be made here, it would be that the 70s and 80s were a moment when political and economic authority seemed so fully contrived, so fully a matter of convention rather than any natural right to rule or to set priorities of value and ethics, that terrorists felt compelled to respond to that, and maybe musicians felt that they could also question the sources of value and power within their own medium. But that connection is pretty diffuse, I would say, and to make any kind of argument for a causal relation between terrorism and post-punk music just seems pretty silly, frankly. I also think it's weird that, the song that Grill Marcus sort of highlights for this is Wires Dot Dash. Certainly not a terribly political song, really, in terms of content or form. Um, and that's something I'm always concerned about in my work, but also in my teaching, is to say to students, does radical content require radical form? There's a lot of post-punk that's considerably more strident, considerably more political, considerably more terrorizing. Yeah, so I think there's a different way to read the use of the music or the song in the film, which is the tension between the kind of pop and the political, or the pleasure and the pain, the pleasure of the pop song and the pain of the politics of the 70s and 80s of global capitalism, neoliberalism, and particularly in the West of the kind of Thatcher-Reagan axis, which I think arguably is the beginning of the politics and the economics that leads us to the moment of now, and the banks versus Occupy, to reduce it and simplify it. It's interesting to think about the way the character is portrayed, and to think about this idea of want, and to think about how in order to want, we first have to kind of want to want, and to think where that want to want comes from, and maybe ultimately where it comes from is a want to be wanted. It may be the only motivation there is, to want to be wanted. It's not just capitalism where the want to want is generated. It seems to me that someone like Carlos might also is necessarily someone whose wants are generated, and who first starts with a want to want. That want may be a want for a cause, that may be for a set of values, it may be for personal fame, glory, fortune, sex, etc. It may be to separate oneself from the average. But before the specifics of his Marxist political positions, before the specifics of his actions, of his terrorist actions, first there's a want to want. There's a desire to find something around which to revolve one's life. Ultimately, I think this is what motivates any of us. But but perhaps there's a way to recuperate that in a political sense, but to say that to want to be wanted is not necessarily a bad thing. It can be a bad thing. It can lead to an awful lot of bad behavior and bad choices. But to want to be wanted, if we take that as the sort of foundation for an ethics, and think about the equivalence of our want to be wanted and anyone else's want to be wanted, maybe that creates a kind of flattened grid upon which we can all sort of function and interact, where everyone's nexus of want and want to be wanted are kind of equal. And so in order to get the want that we want from others, to want to be wanted, we have to want them kind of equally, commensurately. And as long as that wanting goes in both directions, kind of in equal measure, equal intensity, then it seems to me there's grounds for a very positive ethics to sort of be built on that foundation. One thing to consider is how our wants, and then how the manifestations of our wants through various kinds of voicings, through fictional films, fictionalized films, through so-called news, through dramatizations and mythifications for media, through our own thinking, through discussions, through this introduction that I'm providing now and the playlist that will follow, to think about how all those things have implications, ramifications, that they leave a residue. In fact, I think there's a clip where, in the interview with Edgar Ramirez, the actor who plays Carlos, where he talks about having to put on weight for the film, and the interviewer asks him if that had a kind of lasting effect on him personally, that putting on and then taking off weight. And he says that it does have it leaves certain remains and consequences. And I guess, in a sense, that's where I'd like to leave this introduction, to be thinking about the remains and the consequences of our wants, of our want to want, and of the way that we voice those wants. And I guess also the way that we hear the voices of the wants of others. Drum solo.